the last 2 years. I know many of you were at that meeting. You probably heard me say this about 100 times, but that meeting on March 12th at United Way, where we all just, things changed, right? We actually had Shelley on the agenda for the majority of that meeting. And we, remember calling the then commissioner that evening, asking her to, I asked her if she would come and talk about COVID. And then she said, well, I have someone that could do that. And that ended up being Dr. Nick Tomorrow. I said, hey, Nick, do you have 10, 15 minutes to come talk to our group about COVID? I remember going into the office that morning, making copies of fact sheets on COVID and bringing them to that meeting so I can start handing it out. And the rest is history, right? We're here today, 2 years later, and I can't say enough of the hard work and how everyone came together that day to say we just dropped everything and just said we got to do what we got to do. We left United Way. We went over to Tim's place at Pathfinders, continued that conversation, and we all had to obviously, pretty much shift everything we were doing and just focus on the the mitigation of the spread. So here we are, 2 years later, we're still talking about it. We're kind of getting out of this somewhat, on the downside, but as you all know, with the snap of the finger, it can turn quickly and we're back to square one. But I just want to take this opportunity to really thank you all and your staff. I know it hasn't been easy, but we've been through a lot these past 2 years, but I just think there's a lot more to do, and say in the next 2 years. But I just wanted to just throw that out there. And if there's anyone else on this call that just wants to either share, reflect quickly on what their thoughts are in these past 2 years. If not, we could move on the agenda.
I would just add a quick thank you, Raphael, for those thoughts and those comments that I think set an important tone 2 years in. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
I agree. Thank you, Raphael, for those comments. And I do have much gratitude for everybody here because it's been tough. So thanks for your partnership.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's just so many folks that have been doing this work since day one, just grinding, and our hotels, our shelters, you name it. It's been definitely a whirlwind, and I'm sure we'll have a lot to write about as things start to hopefully get to normalcy. We'll see what happens.
This is Shelley speaking for Spectrum Nonprofits. I would say that we've been humbled by the work of this group and folks' ability to both engage in some planning while continuing to address the challenges that have faced this group. So we're humbled by you and appreciate you very much.
Yes, and thanks for your patience, Shelley, because we basically, since that day, we've kind of not necessarily had the time or focus to really dig deep into this whole planning process. Obviously, we had a big chunk allocated that day for strategic planning itself, but that changed. But we're here,
Right.
moving forward and getting things done.
I think that's what adaptive strategy is all about.
There you go. Yes. All right. With that said, let's move on. We have asked Shelley and her team to join us today as we can continue the discussion on our planning process and moving forward. We have some I think some breakout groups and discussions, and I'll let Shelley introduce her team and what to expect for the next, I don't know, 45 minutes to an hour.
Thank you. Let's get started. Well, I'd like to introduce a couple members of the team. Alexander Porte's been with Spectrum for, gosh, about a year and a half, maybe even a little bit longer than that. And he's going to be helping us out today. And Maggie Corey is also with us today. Maybe she can give a shout. Just
I'm right here.
There she is.
Good morning.
And she's our newest team member. And will be joining us today, helping with breakout rooms. So I thank them for joining us. I've told them and reiterated every meeting we've had, so they know what's going on. Not really, but they do. They've been able to take a look at the work that we've done, and will just simply be working with you in the small groups. So let's get started. As I think about, throughout this planning process, there's been emphasis on and discussions about how we can make the COC be less HUD driven, if you will, and instead truly driven by community needs and having the greatest impact that we can possibly have. One way to do this is to define COC priorities that would address those pressing problems, and then determine ways to carry out those priorities, whether it's through federal, state, county, city, or even by raising new funds. So getting ourselves to think less as sort of the HUD COC, instead Milwaukee's COC that operates partly on HUD money and other government funds, as well as other sources of funds. Not to say that those sources of funds aren't critically important. They certainly are. And, it's not that we can't, we no longer have to or want to, well, I'll hold on the word want to, but we can't ignore the rules that come with those funds, those sources of funds. But we want to be more than that. Again, we want to be Milwaukee's COC. So I am going to show my screen and pull up the first of two documents that we sent out in advance of this meeting. And much of the information that you'll see here, you've seen before. I just want to walk through very quickly, reiterate what's here. I hope you've had a chance to look at these documents. This document reflects work of the COC Planning Task Force over the last, I would say, about the year and a half. This is one of the things developed by the COC Task Force, if you will. And that's looking at and defining sort of the ideal service system. What do we want the COC service system to look like? The task force identified elements of the situation, what's missing, what's not working right, what questions do we need to answer. I think I'll make this just a little bit bigger. There's our COC intended impact statement that was developed early on in the planning process and approved by the board. So this is sort of our guiding light. And then we identified some general characteristics about the ideal service system, expectations of each other, partnerships, etc. And then we moved into identifying very specific service delivery approaches, if you will, that exemplify the ideal service system. And those are on the left. And then you'll see on the right at that time what some of the gaps are. So the left is what we wanted as the ideal. The right is where we define what's not ideal, what's missing from that ideal. And so that's this document. So what we're talking about today reflects, a lot of it is reflected in this document. So let me add a new share. We're going to go quickly to document 2. And this reflects information about funding priorities. Again, most of this you have seen before, or it's been made available to you. So again, there's our impact statement. We identified a lot of needs throughout the planning process, which were listed and summarized at our last meeting in December, the last COC leadership meeting in December. And then from that, as you recall, and if you were here, we broke up into 4 groups and each group identified areas that, if carried out, would move the needle on achieving the COC's intended impact or vision. So there's the notes, you got the notes from groups 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then finally, and I'll stop talking soon, some conclusions that we came to reviewing that information. And we're going to take the time today to wrestle with some questions as it relates to what Spectrum is proposing. So these are themes that seem to emerge from those small groups, and it seemed to fall into 2 categories, sort of outcomes that we wanted to achieve, and then strategies for achieving those outcomes. So you'll see 4 outcomes, and then 5 strategies. I don't want us to get too hung up on which is which. They're all important. But you might want to think of strategies as sort of the way to get to those outcomes. So these are the questions that we're going to work with today in the small groups. I want you to think about whether or not, especially focusing on the strategies, are these the right priorities for the next several years? Are they the right ones? If they're not, what's missing or what should be removed? What we don't want to do is add a ton of strategies necessarily. We really want to kind of narrow down to the very most important. So that's the first question each small group will be wrestling with. And and I will say, it's also the most important. That's what we need to gain the most today. But in addition to that, with the time we have, we want you to think about the role your agency already plays in addressing priorities, or what's already happening in Milwaukee. And then finally, how to have a little conversation around how this list, these priorities should affect funding. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to break up into 3 groups. I will be working with 1 group, Alex will be working with another, and Maggie will be working with another, because we wanted to free you up for truly participating. So we'll be taking notes from those meetings. The small groups can't be recorded, so we'll be taking notes. And then I'll ask the groups to come back together. The 3 of us will share notes, but we'll also ask other people to weigh in. Any questions about this process?
Shelley, you may have mentioned this, and I apologize if I missed it, but how much time do we have?
I didn't, and thank you. We'll have, it's 9:18, we'll have probably about 25 minutes in the small group, and then we'll come back together. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Alex to please place us into our small groups, and then we'll get started. I think we're all back. I'll start by just, I know, boy, that time went fast. I don't know how you feel, but I did. And so our group really focused most on the first question and the last question. So a couple highlights, and I will ask folks to weigh in too as I go through this. Most felt that the outcomes, the list of outcomes are generally right. I want to make sure everybody's back. Hang on. Maggie, is your group back?
Yeah, it looks like.
Okay.
Yep, and everyone from my group is back.
All right, mine too. Thanks, folks. All right. So starting with landlord support, there was concern about how that is listed, and the group felt that landlord incentives sort of, and I'm not going to say it right, so I think it was Donna who started this conversation about the wording, and that maybe better wording is, you know, helping landlords understand how we can mitigate risk for their participation. Donna, is there something you can say about that, please?
I have concerns that if we provide cash incentives to landlords, that we're just going to drive up the price of rental costs. And so to avoid that pitfall that we wouldn't be able to sustain, and then people in 2 years would, you know, be outside again, to sort of case manage, I didn't use this word before, but to sort of case manage landlords the way we case manage clients, in that we can support them and provide subsidies, and provide some assurance that we're gonna work as to help mitigate any risk to loss. So rather than the example I used was our case manager recently started negotiating with one of our landlords to bring in a more higher risk family by saying, I promise you, if she doesn't pay rent, that before you start the eviction process, we'll pay that rent and then we'll transition her to another place. So that the landlord felt a little bit more comfortable that they weren't going to have to go through an eviction process as a first choice, and that they also wouldn't lose that rental income for at least 1 month. So what are some other things that we could do to be creative around supporting landlords without creating, you know, an environment where they can jack up their prices?
Thanks. We also talked about case management and emphasizing the individuality of every case, and sort of a balance, and that case management needs to accommodate this, but also establishing some sort of baseline or minimum for case management. And if we're really going to expand case management, making sure that we do that and we fully fund it. Steve, anything you would add? Or Carl? It was Carl, I think, in our group. Anything you would add, Carl?
No, I think you got it. I think it's just, you know, fund the whole position, not just a portion of it, and then just making sure that it's not a blanket case management. I mean, we can put the floor on what the minimums are, but because everyone's different, everyone's issues are totally different, you know, whether it's a large family to addictions to whatever. I mean, they're all stand on their own. So everybody has to have their own deal.
Good, thanks. The issue of early education came up, especially for veterans. I thought was a really important point. Preparing veterans in advance, maybe even of their military services. So once they get out, they know how to manage money. They're educated to do that and don't end up necessarily homeless. So I thought that was an important point. I don't know if there's anything you would add to that, Dr. Hauser. If not, that's just fine, but.
No, I don't have anything to add. I think what they said was really good. I really love when she was talking about how we should be case managing the landlord. So other than that,
I do too.
I agree.
Thank you. Another issue that was raised is that the need for a communication strategy that needs to be in place for those who may need services as well as potential partners. So that's something of note that's sort of missing. Another issue that was raised is, and it's certainly among the priorities, having other access to other specialties to work with case managers who are highly skilled and affordable. Let's see. And access to people who have training and knowledge of our populations, such as with job readiness, that we don't just utilize or partner with an organization on job readiness, but it needs to be the right one who can work with us and with our population. And anybody feel free to interrupt me. I'm almost done. Something missing was identified from the priorities. The issue of having people at a minimum maintain their income, but ideally increase their income, which would help address many of the issues they face. The comment was made that when we think about helping people increase their income, we've often been very benefits focused, but especially for younger folks, who don't have access to those types of benefits, we need to be able to link them better to education and training for better jobs. We talked a bit about advocacy. Let's see, advocating for not just more housing, but housing access. I'm going to ask Audra to pop in here if she would, about how we can think about expanding and getting greater access to housing. Audra?
So we were talking about the use of like master lease situations in order to allow individuals that we're having a really hard time housing because of either criminal background or eviction background. Landlords are just really not willing to rent to them, whereas in a master lease situation, we would hold the lease and we would have the ability and the flexibility to move people in and out regardless of criminal background or like timing.
Perfect, thank you. And then finally, we talked a bit about funding. Again, this issue of funding things as completely, yet if we find that once we cost out these strategies, if we can't fund everything, funding, important pieces of it so that we have some success in particular areas. The other funding issue that came up was that funding, organizations should have access to funding, not just one organization, but multiple and new organizations having access to funding to address these priorities. That's it from our group, unless somebody knows of something that I've missed. Okay, let's move on. Alex?
Sure. So I will keep it brief in the interest of time. So our group mainly focused on questions 1 and 2. And we came back to the same themes. And that main theme is moving from calling out the need for affordable housing and providing services to actually defining what we mean as a COC by affordable and the supportive services. So in one way that we discussed how to define those services and what affordable means is to use data. Use data from other COCs, other locales in the nation, to really define what these terms mean, and then taking those definitions and that data and using and leveraging that to when we approach folks, organizations, service providers, landlords, developers, etc., with the needs of the city.
Yeah.
So to summarize, defining affordable housing, as well as I might be using the wrong word here, I apologize, and the interventions, the services we provide. So that's the first one. Using data to do so, and then carrying those definitions and that data forward when we present the needs of the city. We also talked about, and real quick, we also talked a bit about, what we need to add in terms of support for case management, where and how do we delineate, who's responsible for what? A lot of us working together here, right? And we need to, in addition to continuing to identify folks and stakeholders that can, support our mission and impact, we also need to clearly delineate who is responsible for what. That is a criminally short summary of what we talked about, but those were the main themes.
And we'll have notes, right? Is there anything anyone from that group would add?
Hi, my name is Amy. I'm with Impact. Just been a few weeks, and so this is the first I'm really part of any of this conversation. So maybe this was discussed, or maybe if there's a better person for me to talk offline about it. But some of the things that I haven't necessarily heard that I'm interested about are like the role of the consumer voice. Like when all of the information, the strategies were being identified, was the consumer voice at all brought into that conversation? And speaking specifically about data, what data has really been gleaned to determine any kind of racial disparities between shelter and housing and other access? What role are we playing in making sure, representation matters? So making sure that consumers have case management and other provider support that matches their desires. So again, if this isn't the appropriate place to have this conversation, or if this conversation has happened before, I'm happy to connect offline, but those are some of the things that are coming up for me. Again, just stepping into this kind of midstream.
Thanks, Amy. I think certainly some of the issues have been addressed, but I do think we need to be thinking more too about using data, and that has come up throughout conversations. How about group 3? Maggie?
Sure. So overall, there was general consensus that the strategies that are put out there, tick most of the boxes. One of the major points of discussion was, how do we move from these kind of strategies that have been iterated in many different ways to the implementation of them? So one of the additions of the strategies, and that gets to kind of the point that like Porte was talking about with, defining roles and what do case managers take on, is really creating a structure and looking at the structure of COC for effective implementation to be able to move, using these strategies as the guiding light, but how do all of the things work together? How do all the different agencies work together? How are we ensuring that case managers aren't just given everything? And then this kind of led into the discussion of the bullet point about the stronger supportive services and building that out more to have stronger supportive services that follow the philosophy of housing first, and making sure that each of those points of the philosophy are incorporated into the stronger supportive services. Steve spoke eloquently about behavioral health, so I don't want to shorten the importance of that. So Steve, if you can kind of talk a little bit more about the stronger supportive services and your perspective and everybody else's perspective on how behavioral health fits into that.
Yeah, thanks. I just think that the COC needs to step up its game in terms of integrating behavioral health into almost everything we do. You know, the mental health of the city has gotten worse since COVID. It's our clients, case managers, staff, etc. And we can't be reliant on BHD to come and save the day. We got to do things internally. You know, step up qualifications of staff, integrate those kinds of services into housing, outreach. I mean, you name it. But I think it's just a significant thing that we don't do enough of.
Got it.
And I'll detail this in my notes, Shelley, as well, but I think one of the important points that Emily made was in thinking about how, you know, COC is structured for effective implementation of these strategies, is thinking about how, you know, if you do have these kind of core strategies that everybody's working towards and everybody understands, when there are opportunities, when funding does come in and roles are defined, then people aren't either scrambling and figuring out, you know, should I grab this money? What should happen? But people know where the coordinated effort should move forward. So I thought that was really, there's a lot of nuance in that discussion that I'll break out into my notes, but that was really a lot of what we talked about. So team 3, if I missed anything, please chime in.
Okay, thanks to everyone. We will work with the notes from this group and sort of rework and add sort of more meat to the priorities and get it back to you, hopefully for some getting close to final agreement. Before we close, Raphael, I hate to put you on the spot, but I'm going to ask if you can just say a little bit about at least about the government funding picture right now and why, you know, the urgency around priorities and yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, for sure. I think, and I've mentioned this before in other meetings, but I think we're at a opportune time now to take all of these discussions we've been having in these strategies and priorities and put them into place with some of our funding sources. If it's not necessarily with the current ESG CB money that we have that expires in August, but also the Home American Rescue Plan dollars that we are going to be working on in the next couple of months that will tie in with this the work that we're doing here. Because I also think once we start having a discussion about the home ARP plan that we have to submit to HUD, a lot of work has been done already. We've had a lot of discussions around what our priorities are, and I think this will fit in well, just based on whatever the, you know, eligible activities that we can utilize those funds for in the with the home funds. So I think this is extremely important that we get at least a good picture of what we need to do, I'd say, in the next couple of years. And this, you know, we already have a good jump start. So yeah, that's a great point.
Any questions from the rest of the group, or is there anything you heard that you would be concerned about from the different groups?
Mm-hmm. I'm just curious. I mean, I like the idea of us having like more discussions around, like Steve mentioned, the mental health piece of the struggles we have within our system, and how do we deal with that, or who do we get involved in helping us through that process? I'm just saying it just because I think it's something that we should definitely put on on our radar, to just continue those conversations around what that means and what are some of the gaps or challenges we're having.
So
And yeah, we've
And
seen it. Go ahead.
For folks that aren't aware, we do have behavioral health division representatives at our first intervention meeting every week. So that's where we talk about people that are on street outreach that we're seeing and making sure that we have a plan for those folks. And then also currently it's inundated with warming hotel, but the vision is that it would be kind of anybody who was, it's called first intervention for like rapid rehousing. These are folks that are new to homelessness, and how are we supporting them? So we have representation from both crisis services and CARS at those meetings, and it's been a really good kind of back and forth where they've also brought up folks that they think might be homeless. So we're able to collaborate. It's one step, but
Yes.
it's been a significant one in this last year, I think.
Awesome.
Thanks, Emily.
Great.
Well, then we'll consider this part of your agenda completed, and but we'll leave the room open for you to continue on with the agenda. But we'll say goodbye to the Spectrum staff. Thanks for helping out today, and
Thank you.
hopefully we'll see you all. We'll see you all, everybody. We'll see Spectrum. We'll see you all soon.
Yes. Thank you, Shelley. Thank you, team. All right. Let's go. We have a smaller group. Some folks have jumped off. Any initial like thoughts or about this process and moving forward? We'll get the feedback from Shelley, and then maybe we'll look at our April meeting to regroup and discuss today's meeting and how we kind of move things forward.
So Raphael, what's the end goal here? I mean, what's the it?
Well, I mean, really, it's trying to find the low-hanging fruit that we can work on in the next year, especially with some of this additional funding that we're getting, and be able to tackle some of these system gaps. I think we just have an opportunity now to do that, and I think, if we can narrow our focus on one or two things that we can tackle and improve within our system, let's focus on that. And I think we see a lot of top 2 or 3 issues that we've been talking about for a while now, and I think if we can take some of those and come up with the right strategy to deal with those issues or system gaps, let's just do it now. I'm hoping to have a kind of a final report, let's say, from Spectrum in the next couple of months. But this is also coinciding with, and I don't have a for sure date yet, but coinciding with the planning process that we'll do for the home ARP plan. That makes sense. Any other comments or suggestions?
Hi, it's Donna. So I'm just sort of thinking out loud right now about the sustainability of funding. So, we might do some low-hanging fruit right now, but we need to make sure that low-hanging fruit is, like the one and done kind, whatever that is. Do you know what I mean? Because if we start creating longer term case management positions, for example, or employment programs, how are we going to fund them after August?
Well, I think this is where the home ERP funds come into play, and those funds don't expire until 2030.
Okay.
So we have, and this is, I guess this is why it's extremely important for us to figure out like what's really going to work for us so that we can position ourselves more long-term, because obviously we're not going to get more funding from our just regular formula annual funding sources. So let's take advantage of these funding sources. Obviously, ESGCV held us and it's getting us through these past 2 years. And I think now is kind of taking the momentum from that into the next couple of years with the home ARP funds. What does that look like for us? How can we sustain more supportive services for the next 3 to 4 years or beyond that? How do we sustain more, potential rental assistance or housing units? All those things that we're looking at to build within our system, we can potentially use some of these home ARP funds to do that. But also keeping in mind that, we may have some opportunities to, to bring in other types of funding sources, like, if it's the hospital system, if it's the healthcare system, if it's the private, private foundations. I think there's ways for us to do this, but I bring back, and I talk about our housing authority, and I bring it back to the forefront because I think there's some work to be done. I know that there's some issues and dealing with vouchers, but I think there's an opportunity now to look at that and say, how do we fix some of those issues, some of those barriers, and build upon that so we can continue to potentially use more of those vouchers within our system for the next couple of years. But yeah, as far as sustainability, I think this is the time to think about some of these projects we've been wanting to work on, and we just haven't had the opportunity to do so, but now we do. Any other thoughts? Okay. Speaking of funding, just got some information yesterday as far as just our regular formula funds. Let me pull this up. Give me a second here. They call it the consolidated appropriation bill was there's a good chance that it's going to be voted on sometime this week, and then from there it goes to the Senate for approval. But from what they're saying is that a lot of the funding sources, specifically like ESG, it's going to be kind of steady and flat for next year. There's going to be some increases in COC funding. Another thing they're looking at too is that when we applied for the COC application last year, there was an emphasis on partnerships with the healthcare systems. I think they're going to be looking at that again this year in our COC application for 2022. I think we've been doing some of that already, but I also think there are some opportunities for us to kind of build on that, on some of those partnerships. For us, I think we have the majority of your 2022 budgets in the office. Claire, correct me if I'm wrong. If there are any budgets for ESG and CDBG that still need to be submitted, but I think we're pretty much set. Okay. The other thing is, and obviously with that, as soon as we get the letter, the official award letter from HUD, we'll keep you guys posted. And that all depends on this appropriation bill that gets passed this week and maybe goes to the Senate. Who knows when, but we'll keep you posted. I also want to give you a quick update on ESG CV2. I've asked folks if they're interested in applying for additional rapid rehousing funds that will go to August of this year. So I should at least know by tomorrow where we stand. Keep in mind that we had $1.3 million in rapid set aside from ESG CV2. I'm guessing that entire amount is not going to be distributed for rapid rehousing. So there'll be some funds available. We haven't decided yet like what the next steps are with that. We're still trying to crunch the numbers on the expenses for our hotels. You guys know that we are planning on closing or two of our hotels, 2 out of the 4 hotels at least by the end of this month. And then beyond that, we have the Ambassador Hotel, which will keep a little bit longer, just to as we transition, because we know we're not going to have all 110 or 20 of our folks out of our hotels by the end of this month. So, but I know Emily and the team and everyone's been working really hard to place folks into housing, or I think some are even going back to shelter. But we're still, like I said, we're still crunching numbers on what expenses we're going to have to kind of wrap things up in paying for hotels, but also the once the hotels are emptied, we're having our hotels put together costs for repairs, which is going to be obviously another big expense for the 4 hotels that we're working with. So I should have more information hopefully in the next couple of weeks on ESG CV2 funds. If we open it up to do some additional things that are eligible for ESG CV. Any questions on that? And lastly, I totally forgot. Claire sent out the minutes on Tuesday. If we can just get an official approval for those minutes from the February meeting.
I'll make a motion.
Thank you, Carl. Need a second?
Second.
Thank you, Tim. Any objections? Hearing none. Yeah, I mean, any announcements? Anything happening? Anything new?
Raphael, could you or one of your team provide an update on the state contracts that should have begun July 1st of last year?
Yeah, I posed a question. I'm not sure if Dina's on the call. Posed a question yesterday, and Sarah is waiting for Robin and Sue, who are her bosses, to get back to the office, and they hope to make an announcement by the end of next week. That's what they told me yesterday. Any other announcements or questions? Emily, I don't want to put you on the spot, but am I correct, about 110 folks still in our hotels?
That's correct. Yes.
Okay. Awesome. All right. thank you all. This was good. And I don't see you next month. I'm sure I'll see you guys before that.
Bye.
Thanks. Take care, guys.